Keeping the streets safe is really important, especially in a fantasy world. It's much easier to break a curfew and the law with invisibility magic, shape changers, and all manner of magical creatures. This makes keeping the law and keeping the peace quite the difficult task. Unlike in our own world, where in, for example, British history, watchmen are generally just regular citizens whose job is essentially funded by a payment given by other citizens to avoid doing watchman duty, I think in D&D styled fantasy worlds, we'd see the development of a professional police force a lot earlier. It takes a professional to be trained to deal with all of the potential problems that magic, monsters, and adventurers can bring to the job of keeping the law. But what should these professionals be like? What skills should they possess? And how can they best deal with magical threats? I've identified a few features that make for an excellent fantasy police force. Some borrowed from historical examples, some borrowed from Robert Peel's original constitution in the establishment of the first police force, and some borrowed from fantasy general truths. A good fantasy lawkeeper must 1. Have the trust of the citizens. They must be identifiable by means that are not easy to duplicate through shapeshifting or magic, such as individualized badges and badge numbers to be checked on, for example, and should also be part of an organization that is generally well trusted, such as potentially belonging to the church of a specific deity associated with the city they're protecting, perhaps a patron deity of sorts, or another trusted godly figure. 2. They must be able to work at night. Curfews are an incredibly useful historic way of keeping the peace, considering that much of criminal activity tends to happen under the cover of darkness. Ideally, a good lawkeeper should be able to facilitate the entire guard or the entire militia to work well at night as well, rather than just being able to see for themselves. 3. They must be able to alert a local garrison or guardsman when faced with a serious enough threat. Early police used rattles and whistles because sometimes a single guardsman isn't enough, and frankly, in a world of monsters that can shape change and prowl the night, it might be more often than you think that a single guardsman is not enough. 4. They must be able to restrain, control, or subdue criminals long enough for them to be taken into custody, taken to jail, or brought indeed to justice. Part of this is to non-lethally incapacitate belligerents and have the ability to do magical damage if necessary, if faced with one of those creatures that is resistant or even, God forbid, immune to regular damage. And 5, they must be a first responder, able to pacify violent situations or even administer medical aid when first on the scene. With that all said, I believe there is a way to give the regular guardsman the ability to do all of these things pretty well, without saying that every guardsman in your world has some sort of class levels and is equally as competent as a first level adventurer. That seems a little strange. The answer really comes to us through feats. Specifically, Magic Initiate. The thing is, it might be a struggle to deal with any amount of criminals, to alert other people quickly, or even to light all of the lights in a city without magic. You're going to need an entire separate person for all 3 of those things, potentially. You might suggest dark vision as a solution for seeing in the night, but unless your entire society is filled with people with dark vision, some of your militia will not be able to see unless you provide them with lights along the way. Besides, dark vision just gives you the benefits of seeing in dim light as opposed to complete darkness, which is not ideal for observing things. You're still not seeing amazingly, and some monsters can indeed hide out very effectively in dim light. A better option is a city-wide system of torches and lanterns made incredibly easy to light by spells like Druidcraft and Prestidigitation. So in D&D's rules, to get a feat as part of your character's origin before you even pick a class, you're going to need to either be a variant human or have Tasha's custom lineage, which is one of my favourite additions to the game in a long time, by the way. Honestly, you could theoretically consider an academy that trains kids from their very first breath who have any magical potential into becoming law mages for a city to be a lineage of sorts, especially if it's an ancient academy, albeit, you know, not a biological lineage. But why am I so insistent that we should use Magic Initiate over just giving each guardsman some sort of player class? Well, feats can be the result mechanically of intense training in a specialised fashion, whereas a class is something a little more innate to a person's self. It requires a little more setup, it requires a little more luck and specialness than would be expected from your average town guardsman. But why Magic Initiate and not one of the more powerful standard feats like Sentinel, which allows you to stop any criminal in their tracks if you smack them with a weapon? Because 2 cantrips and 1 first level spell that can be cast once per day is A, pretty easy to add to literally any stat block in the game as a simple add-on, and B, is pretty much all you need to tackle every single objective I outlined earlier. The only question remaining, really, is which of the spellcasting classes has the best spell list for your law mages to protect their city with? The instinctive answer may well be Wizard. After all, the class has the most kind of intuitive reasoning here because wizards learn spells by careful study, and is famous for having a significant and broad spell list. The thing with wizards is that under these specific conditions, they don't necessarily have the tools available to deal with all 5 of the conditions I outlined earlier. Wizards are known for their dedication to the arcane, but they're not traditionally the most personable types. But the bigger issue really here is that enchantment magic probably isn't considered the most ethical way of going around policing a population. Friends may be one of the best spells for this particular purpose, for the purposes of a law mage trying to get people to just cooperate and follow them to sleep off the night in a jail. But it doesn't exactly build trust in the institution of the law mages. Wizards do, however, get Prestidigitation, which is an incredible spell for our purposes. It allows them to instantaneously light any of the street lights that they pass by along their patrol route. It's an incredible utility, and literally clean up the streets if they see anything amiss or dirty. It's really possibly the best spell for this exact purpose. They also get access to the cantrip Dancing Lights, which is possibly the best short to medium range signalling spell in the game. It is very likely that with Dancing Lights and the multitude of different arrangements of lights, you could establish a fairly complex code for alerts and calls for help, referring to the number of belligerents perhaps, the type of crime in progress, and how serious a response force you need or how urgent that response is. Maybe even a certain colour if you need a healer on site as quickly as possible. Just send your dancing lights up into the air straight above you in their coded configuration, and the entire garrison will have exact knowledge of what kind of help you need and where and when you need it. Apprehending criminals, even in large groups, is pretty simple with use of the sleep spell, which is for most commoners at least, a no-save, immediate night-night. making them very, very easy to take to jail and sort out later. And investigated crimes may be made incredibly easy if these magical initiates have access to find familiar. Flying eyes in the air are incredibly useful for scouting out criminal activity and indeed investigating or following particularly awful criminal elements, even as they're escaping. This current spell selection does leave you a little vulnerable to creatures that go bump in the night, however. They might be immune to sleep, they might have too many hit points. You don't really have any ability to damage them, so swapping out one of your cantrips for Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade might be an option, considering you can also use them to subdue regular citizens, seeing as melee attacks technically are the only ones that are capable of dealing non-lethal damage. Alternatively, a law mage wizard in a slightly more authoritarian society could choose Magic Missile as their leveled spell. This is, in essence, a once-a-day, unavoidable, instant kill shot on any regular commoner that is causing trouble. It is the equivalent of equipping police with shotguns. But seeing as you're giving up sleep for this particular spell, which is excellent at crowd control in general for commoners, I can see two distinct styles of law mage wizards developing. One centred around controlling individuals and larger crowds, with prestidigitation, dancing lights and sleep to keep large groups at bay in the worst case. And the other potentially focused around more modern American-styled policing, with friends, dancing lights for alerting allies, and a magic missile in the chamber. I'm ignoring Grease as an option here, simply because it is a real pain to clean up, and if any spark touches that, you've got a long night of paperwork ahead of you. The sorcerer, unfortunately, in this case, is just a wizard with fewer options, which is also somewhat true of the bard. Both work pretty well with the prestidigitation and dancing lights combination, serving them fairly well with rather lackluster first level picks. Bards do get the ability to take Healing Word, which is an incredibly useful spell for being a first responder to the scene, and they also have the option to take Command, which is fairly useful. Command is really all you need to get someone into custody. Drop your weapon, approach and do nothing else. Halt, stop stabbing that guy, or grovel. Get down and let me cuff you. For these reasons, bards are a less nuclear option at single target criminal captures than a wizard with a loaded magic missile. And they have some excellent options to be first responders and help people on the scene. Although this does generally make them, their spell list makes them much more vulnerable to larger groups. Bards are, however, users of the charisma stat. People who use the Bard spell list do use the charisma stat for their spellcasting though, so they are generally a slightly more personable bunch than the wizard magic initiates, as long as command is considered to not be robbing people of their free will, which it certainly could be read as doing. In that case, bards are kind of stuck with Healing Word, which is a long range heal, so you can heal someone who's been stabbed from, half an alleyway away. But it does relegate bards mostly to lookouts and first responders, paramedics sort of things. Speaking of, one might think that the Cleric makes an excellent law mage, considering they are figures of general public trust. They serve a hopefully well-liked deity with a reputation for incorruptibility and a pretty powerful spell list to boot in at least the regular game. They have healing capabilities for victims and access to command, much like bards. But like bards and wizards to some extent, they don't really have a good way to scare off a magical belligerent with their show of force without also threatening immediate instant death to a commoner. It turns out that a combination of spells that can incapacitate and knock out regular people, but are also threatening to larger monsters and probably aren't just your first level spell blasted at the monster, because that's not repeatable in the monster. If the monster learns that that's a pattern, that you're tapped out after one first level spell and they survive it, you're a bit screwed. A cleric's best option is possibly thaumaturgy, which can alert their allies if they need any particular help, can throw open a door that needs to be thrown open in their way while they barge in with shield and mace at the ready. But it crucially doesn't have the ability to light torches or fires or lanterns along the street as they move. They're not quite as useful for a whole watch. Seeing as they have no way of lighting lanterns, they kind of need to focus on the other skills. Probably some sort of a damaging cantrip to scare off any particular enemy. This obviously has the downside of probably killing any regular person at least 50% of the time. Or they can take Spare the Dying, which is a cantrip that can save multiple people throughout a night, which is pretty good. This really depends on how violent of an area that they're in, or how many magical monsters they're expecting to face. Command or Healing Word are probably their best first level picks, which, depending on morality, may just end up being Healing Word. This is largely due to the extremely lackluster control options on the first level Cleric spell list. Warlocks are a really interesting case. They work brilliantly in less morally good inclined regions and empires as inquisitors of sorts. In these environments, you can definitely make use of friends for pretty easy social encounters without much downside if the populace already is under significant authoritarian fear, and perhaps take Booming Blade, which is very unlikely to kill your average person straight up, considering it can be done as melee damage unless they, are stupid enough to choose to move later on, which also gives them some repeatable threat towards magical creatures of the night, all the while keeping Charm Person in their back pocket as a first level spell for those extra annoying and uncooperative individuals. Being charisma based, Warlock law mages are probably going to try and convince or magically coerce criminals to follow them to jail, as opposed to necessarily getting into serious physical altercations to bring people in. This allows them to some extent to sacrifice the spells that are able to alert people, because they can kind of pacify a crowd or an individual fairly simply using this enchantment magic that might be taboo in other cultures. Although a particularly nasty regime may teach their warlocks Arms of Hadar for particularly troublesome and annoying groups. Yes, it's not unlikely to kill the average person, but it is certainly a spectacle when your law mages start busting out the 10-foot reach of tentacle horror bursting out of their chests. It's likely deadly, but then again, those protesters really shouldn't have been making trouble. The thing that makes this work best for a more authoritarian society is the fact that warlocks, generally even magic initiated warlocks, have some sort of patron relationship with their magic. A particularly powerful entity, such as a fae or fiend, may just decide to take over a city one day, institute their own police force, and grant this power to their law enforcers or their inquisitors. It makes an awful lot of thematic sense within the Warlock brand, as it were, that an entire city's policing force could be given these powers almost overnight as part of a controlling effort by their new, hidden, extraplanar master. Last but certainly not least, the Druid. These initiates actually get access to some unique options which make them very useful indeed. Firstly, while Druidcraft can't clean up the streets to quite the same extent as prestidigitation can, it can still light a lamp or torch instantaneously, and has the power to allow the bearer to predict the weather, which can be incredibly useful for planning guard patrols, planning responses to adverse weather conditions, and generally keeping people safe from adverse weather conditions. Druids are pretty much the only class to get an impressive crowd control ability that works on both people and high-powered monsters on their first level spell list. Sleep kind of counts, but it doesn't work if the enemy has too many hit points, and Grease is arguable, again, very messy. Entangle is a great spell for fleeing groups or individuals, creating difficult terrain in a 20-foot square, and locking anyone down who's going to fail a specific strength save. This, likely with regular people, gives plenty of time for other guards to arrive, and in the case of a horrific monster, even if it succeeds on its save, it gives you some time to move away and potentially alert someone. But how do you alert someone? Unfortunately, Druids basically have no access to any spell that is easy with which to alert allies to come to their aid. They must probably instead rely on more old-fashioned analog methods of creating a noise or distraction or some sort of alert. Rattles, whistling, or whistles themselves, perhaps a loud shout. These are far less precise than a coded dancing light sent into the air like a flare, and perhaps far less trackable as well in narrow bouncing audio streets. Thankfully, Druidic law mages are the most self-sufficient of any of the law mages that we have looked at today, largely because they have access to Shillelagh. This is an incredible tool for dealing consistent damage to magical beasties, while also being an excellent way to consistently and reliably do non-lethal damage to humanoid targets. Add to that even if a club or staff is disarmed from a druidic law mage, it's significantly less deadly for said law mage or the people around them than if they had been carrying a bladed weapon, for example. And there is a trust element here too in carrying a blunted stick, as with the earliest police, all the way through to modern times. Generally, clubs and truncheons are the weapons of choice. Maces at some points in what would be considered bodyguarding, not policing in British history, but generally non-bladed weapons are the ones of choice to A, avoid them being turned on the police officers themselves, and B, to generally just show that these people are not intending to use deadly force. Now, it is true that you could be using Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade on a staff, as well as a blade, as the name suggests, because the only requirement in it is that you're carrying a weapon that is worth more than 1 silver piece, which makes absolutely no sense. However, a quarterstaff is worth 2 silver pieces, so it is able to be used with Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade. However, the secondary effects of both of those spells cannot be, by the rules, non-lethal damage. So if you smack someone with Booming Blade and it doesn't knock them out and then they move, they might be dead. Or perhaps they are the target of a spreading flame instead, which can be a massively serious issue when trying to just simply subdue common folk. Druids are also generally fairly well respected, being connected with nature and deities therein. And with wisdom as a primary score, they are better than average at administering aid in general through things like medicine checks, and better at spotting things through perception checks, even if they're not proficient in either. Even a druid with no proficiency in medicine or healing kits might just be better than anyone else in the immediate vicinity at tending to a wound, even if they don't have access to healing magic as their first level spell choice. And they've picked, Entangle instead, which is probably the better choice, generally. It does crowd control and can do single target as well. Add into all of this the possibility of druids building their law mages around spells like Healing Word or indeed Goodberry, and we get some brilliant results. I think druids are probably the best law mages in the game. I mean, Goodberry allows you to heal the sick, save someone's life, or feed hungry vagrants up to 10 times a day, which can only be generally quite good for society. Druids are trustworthy due to their connection with nature, gods, and general perceived neutrality, able to alert allies, albeit through the use of external tools. This is possibly the weakest of their points. They're fully capable of restraining multiple or single targets using Entangle, and Shillelagh is a serious, sustained threat, even to creatures like werewolves, who are immune to all kinds of non-magical damage. They can even help people, especially if they're given some medical training in the Shillelagh Druidcraft Entangle build, or be genuine forces for good in society around an entire city with the Shillelagh Druidcraft and Goodberry build. But the truth is, all of these law mages that we've discussed today, all of the classes have some merit. Except sorcerers. Sorry, sorcerers. I mean, I guess being charismatic helps you deal with social challenges a little better than your wizard counterparts, but you've still got a slightly less versatile spell list and fewer directions that a sorcerer law mage can go in than a wizarding one. In any case, it's my opinion that every fantasy town should have at least a couple of these individuals, elevated guards, law mages, dotted throughout their ranks, professionals in their craft who've trained at a proper academy or trained under a druid master for some of the magical skills that help people actually survive the onslaught of a fantasy world. And if it were up to my personal recommendation, I'd say gather up the wisest folks you can find. Give them a staff and a rattle, or perhaps both combined. Perhaps a staff with a rattle built into its very head, so whenever it is brought out to be wielded properly by a druid, it automatically makes that noise. And send them out to fight criminals throughout the night as druidic magic initiate law mages. And that's where we're going to end this video, with our law mages all set out and statted out. I hope you get to use them in your games, and I hope that this idea resonates with some people. I'm considering looking deeper into the origins of guarding and protection and things of that description, perhaps with an angle to creating an entire resource for people about historic guarding practices, historic policing practices, and exactly these sorts of things, how to incorporate law mages and people who are actually going to be competent at dealing with the magical threats of a fantasy world into your games. But that's something to think about. Do let me know if that sounds interesting to you. But with all that said, thank you so much for watching. I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thanks again for watching the video, and, well, I'll see you in the next one.